Hello there, welcome to this Making of America revision video. This is going to focus on topic 4, settlement and conflict on the plains from 1861 to 1877. In this revision video, we're going to look at the causes and nature of white American exploitation of the plains, railroad, ranches and cow towns. We're going to talk about homesteaders living and farming on the plains. We're going to look at Native American wars, including Little Crow's War, Red Cloud's War and the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877. So without further ado, let's find out more. In terms of Making America, these are the key narratives that you need to be aware of. The key subgroups are Native Americans, Black Americans and White Americans. In this revision video, we're going to be talking about settlement and conflict on the plains from 1861 to 1877. So this is what was going on at the same time as Civil War and Reconstruction, which we looked at in the last revision video. Okay, in terms of Making America, this is how you'll be assessed. So you've got your 3 gateway questions, you've got your clear and organised summary question, which you need to link to 1 or more second order concepts. You're going to include 2 key paragraphs there. You've got your question 3, which is a why question, or to be honest with you, on Making America, they quite often have a what was the impact question. So that one focuses on cause and consequence. And in question 4 or 5, a how far do you agree question, where you need 4 key arguments, you need to have a degree of balance, and you need a conclusion where you have a clinching argument. Okay, so let's find out about the idea of settlement and conflict on the plains. We're going to talk first about railroads, ranches and cow towns. Now, one of the key things to be aware of, and you can see in the picture there, is that the new transcontinental railroad united the eastern and western states of America during this time. Now, we already talked about that a little bit when we talked about Pike's Peak Gold Rush, in terms of how lots of people are able to get across the country now in terms of the railroads, and that obviously accelerates the migration west and fulfills that idea of the manifest destiny. So we know that from the 1840s, the idea of the manifest destiny became common in the US. The idea that God had given North America to the US so they could promote freedom, democracy and progress. Now that idea neglects to tell the story of slavery or the presence of Native Americans in lands that the white Americans sought to take control of. Now, in the 1860s, a great project was carried out to build a railroad line to connect the east and west of the United States. And during the 1860s and 1870s, this led to the plains becoming a battleground between Native Americans and white Americans. Now, the new transcontinental railroad united the eastern and western states of America, and you can see there some of the different train lines that were built, the so-called Pacific Railroads, the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific Railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad, and the Southern Pacific Railroad, lots of them going, of course, to San Francisco as a key place there. Now, the American government had been exploring the idea of a transcontinental railroad since the 1850s. In 1862, President Lincoln approved a Pacific Railroad Act, which promised to provide money to companies willing to build a railroad connecting the east and west of the country. Railroad companies were given land on either side of the tracks and money to construct the railroad lines. The Union Pacific Company built from the east towards the west, and you can see their train line there, and the Central Pacific Company built from the west towards the east. The line was completed in 1869, by which time both companies owned more land than the whole state of Texas, and the railroad would enable white Americans to farm on the plains, and really very much opens up the plains to that westward expansion. So the railroads had both positive and negative impacts on groups in the USA. So in terms of the impact on railroad companies and investors, railroads made these companies and people associated with them extremely wealthy. So by 1864, $50 million was made available to encourage companies to start building. In terms of Native Americans on the plains, the railroads cut through Native American lands and disrupted the buffalo hunting grounds. They also encouraged more settlers and cattle ranchers to settle on Native American lands on the plains. White Americans came to dominate the plains as well. In terms of impact on workers, thousands of workers were needed to build the lines. Over 12,000 workers were Chinese immigrants, people coming to the USA from China. They received little pay and worked in dangerous conditions. Accident rates were very high, especially when blasting through the Sierra Nevada or the Rocky Mountains. In terms of impact on the USA, new towns were created on the railroad lines. Many of these could be violent, drunken and unruly. However, towns soon grew and law and order improved. The first railroad inspired the building of other lines across the West. By the 1880s, the journeys across the USA could be made in days instead of months. Now, the building of the railroads therefore grew to an expansion of the cattle industry, thanks to the railroads and the grass on the plains, although there were conflicts during this time. Now, the American Southwest was full of hardy cattle that was known as Texas Longhorns, and as early as the 1850s, some ranchers in Texas had kept and sold these cattle for money. The cattle roamed freely on the open range. Cowboys would round them up and drive the cattle to sell. Now, after the American Civil War, many Texan soldiers who were from the Confederate side returned home to find their cattle stocks had grown hugely while they'd been away at war. Some people realized they could make money by driving the cattle to railroad stops and then selling the beef to cities or to the agents of Native American reservations. In 1886, Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving made $24,000 by selling 2,000 cattle. They hired 18 cowboys to help them to make the journey. Now, taking cattle over the plains to be sold became known as the long drive. Soon, many people were attempting to make money from it. The long drives, however, caused conflict with Native American tribes whose hunting grounds, buffalo hunting lands, were disrupted by the cattlemen. So some pioneering Americans tried to make even more money by setting up new towns and cattle ranches, and this led to the development of what was known as the cow towns. Now, cow towns were located on the railroad lines, and they became places where cattle were bought and sold. Now, one of the first famous cow towns was called Abilene in Kansas, and you can see a picture of it there. Cowboys could rest and spend their wages at cow towns. Cow towns were located on what was called the Chisholm Trail. Examples were places like Abilene, Ellsworth, Newton, Dodge City, Wichita, they're all in Kansas, Cheyenne, which is in Wyoming, Omaha, which is in Nebraska, and Dallas, which is in Texas. Early cow towns were quite violent and drunken places, but by the 1870s, many of them developed their own laws and hired sheriffs and police in order to keep the order. Cattle ranches also developed. They were located on the plains. They were set up so that cattle did not have to be driven all the way from Texas. One of the first cattle ranchers was called John Illiff, who bought his cattle from Charles Goodnight and emigrants on the Oregon Trail. Cattle roamed free and cowboys were needed to stop the cattle from roaming too far. There were sometimes clashes between ranchers and Native Americans. Cattle ranches needed a lot of grass and water, and overgrazing became a big problem. The other consequence of this was homesteaders. Now, homesteaders, what we mean by homesteaders, they're the first farmers who tried to turn the plains into rich farmland. So basically, they're people that go to live on the plains in order to farm. They began settling there in the early 1860s. Thousands of homesteaders headed west in the 1860s and 1870s. And during the 1870s, 500,000 homesteaders moved to just one of the states in Midwest Kansas. Now, remember, this is a big change because previously the plains were seen as a place that was inhospitable and that nobody could live there. And although people travelled across the plains in the 1840s and 1850s, they were moving to the far west to places like California and Oregon rather than settling in the plains. So the big change during this time period is that the plains become a place that is seen that can be settled and people can live on. So we've got the cow towns, we've got the cattle ranches, and we've got the homesteaders. So next part of the topic we're going to look at is living and farming on the plains. Now, push and pull factors led to people moving to the plains. So you need to think about the question, why did people move to the plains? Well, firstly, the Homestead Act of 1862 offered people 160 acres of land if they farmed it for 5 years and paid a small fee. Single women could also apply. 10 to 15% of homesteads were owned by women. Cheap land was available to buy on the plains. It was an alternative to buying the more expensive land in California and Oregon, which was starting to fill up after all the migration there in the 1840s and 1850s. Railroad companies advertised the plains as a great place to farm land. Adverts showed what could be done by moving to places like Kansas, and that enticed many more to make the move. Ex-slaves freed after the Emancipation Proclamation could buy land to farm and escape the South. The 1860s were an unusually good period for rain on the plains, making it a more desirable place to go. New technology also allowed water to be extracted from the ground more easily, and the banking crisis meant that many people were out of work. Railroads also allowed people to sell farmed goods to cities more easily. So in the 1860s, homesteaders began to set up new lives on the plains, but they faced many difficulties in doing so. We already know that the attitude of the plains before 1860 was that it wasn't a place that you could live on, so it's no surprise that people found it difficult to live and settle on the plains. So these are some reasons why living on the plains was hard. Firstly, the plains were a long way from big towns, so it's hard to get supplies. Most people had to improvise and find a new way to survive. Families could often become lonely and isolated because there weren't lots and lots of people living around. There were very few trees on the plains, so it was hard to build houses. This meant that houses were small, and the lack of trees meant it was hard to keep warm in winter because there was a lack of firewood. There was also a lack of clean water. We already know that there was a lack of water on the plains. It was difficult to get hold of. There wasn't a lot of rainfall. And this meant that diseases like cholera, a waterborne disease, and typhoid, a bacterial disease, spread quite quickly. Diseases like pneumonia and scarlet fever were also common. The climate was harsh. In winter, there were freezing temperatures and deep snow. In the summer, temperatures could rise to way high in the 30 degrees Celsius, and droughts were really common as well. Keeping clean was difficult. Most houses had an earth floor. Mice, fleas, bed bugs were really common, and a lack of water, of course, meant it was hard to keep clean. Farming was also really difficult on the plains. The plains were really open, not sheltered at all. This meant that harsh winds could completely destroy crops. In the summer, extreme heat could cause fires on the prairie grass, and crops struggled to grow as there was so little water. Ploughing the land to grow crops was extremely hard as the land had not yet been farmed before. Buffalo and wild cattle could trample across the farmland and ruin a year's crops so easily. Locusts also swarmed across the plains, destroying crops, eating leather boots, and even eating window frames. However, homesteaders came up with many clever solutions to survive on the plains. Homesteaders built houses on the plains that were built of sod earth instead of wood. Sod houses could be built quickly and easily at a low cost. As more people moved to the plains, farmers grouped together. They started to build communities. They built schools, churches, and whole communities rose up, and that tackled the problem of things like loneliness, for example, and people worked together. Wind pumps were used to harness the power of the prairie winds. They could be drilled into the ground and draw up clean water from way, way deep down. Farmers learned dry farming techniques and brought over new types of wheat, such as Turkey Red, which needed less water. Barbed wire fencing was used as a cheap way to enclose land and protect it from marauding buffalo and wild cattle. Homesteaders worked together to plough the land, and they pooled their resources and labour and worked together to find solutions to their problems. Women helped with ploughing, something they would not have done in the East or in Europe. Settlers shared crops if one family was unable to plant in time for spring, and children were given the task of collecting buffalo chips, which is buffalo dung, which could be burned for cooking or for heating. So lots of inventive solutions were come up with by homesteaders to allow them to live successfully on the plains. Here we can see some pictures of that. So we can see some homesteads from the 19th century. A wind pump can be seen in the right hand side of the first picture, which was used to bring water to the surface. So, because of all the homesteaders on the plains and the development of the plains, this led to growing tension between white settlers and Native Americans, and it led to something called the reservation policy. White Americans and Native Americans on the plains came into conflict during the 1860s and 1870s due to competition over land and resources. Although the Sioux were successful at the start, by 1877 they had lost the vast majority of their lands. Their nomadic way of life clashed with white settlers. By the 1860s, the plains were being viewed as potentially usable land for white settlement, as we've just seen. White American settlement used up land and resources such as water. The Transcontinental Railroad disrupted Native American hunting grounds and led to growing tensions. And the settlement of Colorado and the plains after Pike's Peak Gold Rush led to conflict over land and resources, especially over grass and water. White American attitudes towards Native Americans hardened. The manifest destiny was something that many of the Americans believed in. And the government began a policy of moving Native Americans onto reservations. Reservations were set-aside pieces of land which would not interfere with white settlement. Now, many Native American tribes, especially the Sioux, refused to keep reservation agreements. Increased gun ownership led to increased violence on the plains, and by 1865, 1 in every 3 households owned at least 1 gun. Wars began to be fought on the plains. Now, one of the first wars for you to be aware of is the Little Crow's War, and that was a protest against government policy towards the Sioux. And there you can see a picture of Little Crow pictured in the 1860s. Now, the causes of Little Crow's War was that Little Crow, who was chief of the Santee Sioux, had signed a reservation agreement in 1861, which gave up to 28 million acres of land in return for supplies from the US government. The Santee Sioux were facing starvation in 1862, but the reservation agent refused to open up emergency stores. One of the reservation traders said, if they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung. So you can see there that very hostile attitude of white Americans towards Native Americans, reneging upon the agreements that had been made. So what this led to was that in the summer of 1862, Little Crow led his warriors and attacked white farms and settlements in Minnesota. They killed around 500 settlers, including the trader, whose mouth was stuffed with grass. The Minnesota militia soldiers fought back, and Little Crow was surrounded and killed in September 1862. Aftermath. On the 26th of December 1862, 38 Santee Sioux warriors were publicly hanged while hundreds more were sent to prison. Some white settlers were angry that so many Sioux had been spared. The remaining Santee Sioux were forced to move to a reservation in Dakota. So the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 saw 133 Cheyenne people massacred by the 3rd Colorado Volunteers. Now, we already know that gold was discovered at Pikes Peak in 1858 when white American settlers came onto the lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in Colorado. In 1861, the US government forced them onto a small reservation between the Arkansas River and Sand Creek in eastern Colorado. Now, the Native Americans could not survive there, and government agents refused more supplies. And this led to Cheyenne warriors hunting outside the reservation and attacks on white settlements. In 1864, President Lincoln granted the governor of Colorado permission to raise an army to fight what he called the Indian threat. The 3rd Colorado Volunteers were formed, but the Chief Black Kettle and his Southern Cheyenne came to discuss peace, and the volunteers were known as the Bloodless Third. On the 13th of November, a white settler was killed by a young Cheyenne warrior, and on the 29th of November, the 3rd Colorado Volunteers rode down on Black Kettle's camp. 133 Cheyenne, including men, women and children, were massacred. The event became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. Okay, so the next one for us to find out about is about Red Cloud's victory against the US government, which forced them to give the Sioux more land. So in 1851, the Sioux had signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the US government, who promised to respect Sioux lands. Now, in 1862, gold was discovered on the Sioux reservation in Montana, and miners began pouring in along what was called the Bozeman Trail, which was a mining trail. Red Cloud of the Lakota Sioux led attacks against some of these miners, and the US government began setting up army forts on Sioux land. Between 1866 and 1868, Red Cloud and his warriors fought the US Army with a number of other Lakota leaders, including Crazy Horse. Eventually, the government was forced to admit defeat. So there's a picture of Red Cloud from the Lakota Sioux. Now, the government signed another treaty at Fort Laramie, a key US fort, in 1868. The treaty gave the Sioux even more land, including the Black Hills of Dakota, which was a really important sacred religious site for the Sioux people. And he promised that the American government promised that no settlers would enter the lands without permission. The defeat was humiliating for the government, and many argued that tougher policies were needed. From 1868, control of the conflict was handed to General Sheridan and Sherman, who were Union soldiers. Okay, so the last major conflict was the Great Sioux War. Gold was discovered on the Black Hills of Dakota on Sioux lands in 1874. Now, the Fort Laramie Treaty had promised that no white Americans would enter Sioux lands. And General Custer was sent by the US government, leading to thousands of miners going into the Sioux lands. Now, government officials negotiated a treaty to purchase the Black Hills of Dakota for $6 million. Now, Red Cloud and other chiefs agreed to it, but other chiefs such as Sitting Bull refused to sign because the site was sacred. President Grant ordered all Sioux and allied Native Americans to return to the reservations by January 1876, but they didn't. In the spring of 1876, Sitting Bull had a vision that Native Americans would win a great victory over the whites. On the 6th of June 1876, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse wiped out an army camp by the Rosebud River, a US Army camp by the Rosebud River, and they set up camp on the bank of the Little Bighorn River. So with the Native Americans on their camp by the Little Bighorn River, this led to the Battle of Little Bighorn. On the 21st of June, General Custer and his 7th Cavalry were ordered to find Sitting Bull and drive them towards the main army. By this time, there were 6,000 Native Americans camped on the Little Bighorn. Custer split his force and found the camp, and he charged his 210 cavalry into Sitting Bull's camp. The Sioux were taken by surprise, but Crazy Horse led a counterattack. Many of the white soldiers' weapons jammed, and Custer ordered a retreat, and the Sioux closed in. In only a few minutes, Custer and his entire troops had been killed. Although the Sioux had won a great battle, they were unable to win the war. Although Sitting Bull won, the US Army kept chasing him and the other Sioux. All Sioux bands were rounded up by the army, even if they had nothing to do with the fighting. Rations were even stopped on the reservations, and eventually the Sioux were forced to sell their lands and were moved to smaller reservations. And this had a huge lasting impact, and we can see here that concludes those Native American wars, those conflicts between white Americans and Native Americans during this time period. Okay, so thanks for listening. I hope that was useful and that you got lots of information from that. Thanks very much.